Great. So, a very warm evening, morning, afternoon, wherever you are placed right now across the world. And it's once again an absolute pleasure for me, for all of us, to have Professor Lewis Gordon back. And I'm saying back because last year also we had a fascinating conversation with Prof. Gordon and which is again archived on the Roots and Roots YouTube archive. At any point of time, feel free to go and just check it out. And I believe the perspective that we are going to share, we are going to engage with, is of course a deep down continuation of not only the Adda that we had last year, but also at different points of time that I had the wonderful privilege of engaging with Prof. Gordon across the time in different formal and informal places. So, Prof. Gordon is currently the chair of the philosophy department at the University of Connecticut. He has, for various decades, have extensively worked on different aspects of pedagogy about learning, about decolonial existence, about Black existentialism, about decolonizing knowledge, and various other interrelated perspectives. He holds multiple honorary and advisory positions across different universities and research institutions across the world. Um, and today, what we are going to do is it's a topic I would say which is it's a perspective rather I would say which is very close to both of our hearts, and I'm sure the other people who have joined us will also very much resonate with the conversation and feel free to engage very actively. A very, very warm welcome, Prof, once again in the Roots and Roots Arta series.
Thank you very much, and congratulations to you for your being among the Outstanding Book Award winners for the Nicholas Guillen Prize. You received it this year. A hearty congratulations. And this just arrived. This is the 30th anniversary edition of Bad Faith and Anti-Black Racism.
Terrific.
Maboko More, yeah, it's thicker because Maboko More wrote a foreword, Paget Henry and Jacqueline Martinez wrote afterward. So it's been a terrible year for many people, but the paradox of life is that a lot of very good things have happened as well.
Of
A
course.
lot of yin and yang.
Of course, and I'm very much looking forward to read the latest edition. I have been following this development on the social media. So thank you so much, Prof, for sharing this grand news with us.
Well, thank you. But again, I'm more excited for the younger generation at your achievements.
And thank you so much, Prof, also for once again your very warm congratulatory note about the book award. And I think, I mean, since you just shared this again once again officially sharing this 30th anniversary edition with us, I think on this particular note, and since a lot of the perspectives of this work very much is founded on the values and the visions of liberatory pedagogies, let me start with a very foundational question. And I know that you have talked about this in multiple avenues, but still, I think the conversation remains very much relevant in a time of extreme levels of intolerance, genocides, ecocides that we see happening across the world. Um, where we have always had this imaginary idea that universities are the space. If there are no space existing in this world, then universities are one of those very few safe spaces where we can at least come together, disagree with each other, be very different from each other, but still feel safe with each other, and be, most importantly, being able to voice our perspectives and concerns. Of course, considering the fact that it's not that universities never had violent histories. We do know there are universities across the world which are founded on the perspectives of enslavement, violence, destruction, funding from bodies that are also funding warfares and genocides across the world. I mean, being very aware of this perspective. Still, we see that universities have been that space. People have at least imagined to be that safe space, which is, of course, shrinking further. No doubt about that, which is shrinking further. I mean, we have, apart from you, Professor Jane Anna Gordon, of course, Franz Fanon, our very elderly professor Gugiwa Thiongo, and various other scholars across, or in India, we talk about Rishi Aurobindo, we talk about Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. I mean, people across generations have outlaid patterns and perspectives of how universities can be liberatory pedagogical spaces of praxis. Still, with time, it is shrinking. What are your thoughts? What are your perspectives about this, Prof?
Well, first, when we say universities, we're really using the word metonymically. The so we'd have to step back a little, okay, to understand that universities are fundamentally at their heart, right? They're fundamentally connected to the human condition, okay? The what we're dealing with right now is the revolt of misanthropy. So already at the heart of the revolt of misanthropy requires an attack on any institution whose fundamental purpose is the cultivation of our humanity. So that's straightforward. Some of the things you mentioned about when universities function in negative ways, it's not actually endemic to universities. It's actually, if we look back through history, the moments of reactionary times like the ones we're having now. Okay? So to get a sense of it, we need to think through. For instance, we don't have to say university. It's just that. That's become the hegemonic formulation. We could say, for instance, the way, for instance, in Greek, it's funny when I was in Athens and I want to go to university. They pointed to the bus station with the sign, and it said Panepisteme, and Panepisteme uh, d- uh, doesn't translate as university. Okay, it's panologies. Okay, so the idea is supposed to be right meeting of different ways of producing knowledge. Different societies in their language, in different cultures, use different terms. But for because we have a limited time, I'll just work through the English, Latin, and Greek formulations, but they're not the exclusive ones. We can work through, for instance, Medunetter. We could work through Bantu speaking language. We could work through Hindi, Gujarat, Tamil. We could work through, Nahuatl. There are so many languages. There's so many ways of talking about this. But the basic insight is actually goes way before we formally use the word university. And it's connected to something that is not only about us, Homo sapiens or Homo sapiens sapiens. It's also connected to the general groups we're from, called the hominins. Okay, one of the things that's fundamental about hominins is that we are creatures who are not very strong. We're not very powerful. A lot of our ancestors were easy pickings for the lions, the tigers, even the raccoons could kick our butt. So our ancestors faced a situation of profound exigency. However, the transition into symbolic life, it's not just that we develop spears and arrows and varieties of ways of not only hunting, but protecting ourselves, but we developed something extraordinary, which is language. we develop the ability to communicate and not simply to give in for orders or information, go over there, move over there, animal there or nice fruits there. That's just signs. What we began to move into is the world of symbolic life, as Ernst Cassirer would say, but there are many others who talk about it. And once we moved into symbolic life, we moved into a world in which it's not just about reality, it's about a reality we can live in. We created the world of human reality, the world of meaning. And in that world, it's not simply about food there, it's about what kind of food. Does it taste good? How do we prepare it? How do we like it? How do we ritualize it? Should we, even if it's delicious, should we refrain? Should we share it? In other words, we transform into culture and begin to live through meaning. So for us, it's not simply that we eat, it's the meaning of eating. For us, a taste, rice is not just rice. Vegetables are not just red vegetables. It could be the flavor of your childhood. It could be reminder of your mother, your father, how you create bonds. So once that situation happens, something else happens, which is we begin to create parameters. We begin to create this unusual thing called homes. We begin to create environments in which we, through suspending exigency, enable us to spend more times on one another. In other words, we begin to spend more time in the human world. That transition is very crucial. And I'll just, because it's to save time, the Greek word for it was skole. Skole means leisure time. It's the word from which we get school. Leisure time means not having to worry about life and death at the level of urgency, not being able to worry, not having to worry about at the moment whether you're going to eat or not, or whether you're going to be eaten or not. You can reflect upon other things, uniquely human things. And this liberated us into the world of humanitas. This is the Latin version, but the Greek version is dealing with anthropoi. But we don't need to get there. We could, whether we'd like, it could be in the ancient Metaneter version of Rumt, which is in in that language. Ancient Metaneter is the language of ancient Kemet, the language of ancient Egyptians. But there are many. If you're in ancient China, you could say Ren. But the basic point is we begin to realize, oh, this is something only we do. Now, it doesn't make it superior. It doesn't make other animals inferior. There may be leisure things other animals do. It's just that when we do leisure things, they're uniquely human leisure things. Whether it's sports, whether it's poetry, whether it's conversations, laughter, play, whether it's looking at the cosmos, whether it's philosophy, and you could see how this generates a whole lot of what we tend to learn. But the crucial thing is it is linked to communication. So at the heart of it is community. So the community, the communicative, the communicological practice being linked to community, that is the early schools. And in the process, we share it across generations. And we began to realize that these things are crucial. Now, even though I mentioned this, I have to add that many people, when we tell these stories, we still have a lot of colonial hegemonic ways of thinking of the past. So for some people, as I tell these stories, I'm sure their imagination is a bunch of dudes sitting around saying, we got leisure time and let us think. It's just like, for instance, and when I look at these um, these evolutionary anthropological drawings and portraits. I was watching a documentary recently that talked about, for instance, the mutation of blue eyes. And blue eyes basically popped up, roughly about 10 or 20,000 years ago. But whatever, the main point is every time you see this, you always see this. You see that you see these ape-like creatures, and you see a white dude. But the problem is 10,000 years ago, there were no light-skinned human beings. So the blue-eyed person was a dark-skinned person with blue eyes. Light-skinned people only popped up about 6,000 years ago, very recently. So similarly, there's a masculinism when we tell these stories, and that's why I mentioned dudes. But if you look at a lot of the archaeological research, for the earliest human beings to be able to have a space of leisure time, it had to be a place, especially if you're going to share it with children, in which animals are not going to, while we're sitting down our leisure times, jumping and pick us off. Often this meant then going into places that's difficult to get into, remote caves, etc., with fire. And within those caves, we also share this symbolic knowledge in paintings and other forms. This is among the reasons why the vast majority of very ancient art, okay, some estimate 75% of this art was done by what we would call women, okay, anatomical females at least. But the reason I have to say anatomical females, we don't know what those early people called or even considered themselves to be, you see? But these anatomical females with, at that time, with children, which was choice meals for a lot of the predators, would have to create a safe space through which to share the knowledge, okay? And if you look at a lot of the histories of early learning communities, a lot of them were female dominated, okay? In ancient Egyptian, for instance, or Kemetan, there's a concept called rex. And within the people who participated in rex were the reket. The reket were predominantly, I say predominantly because we don't know, there could have been anatomical males who were considered women. So, but they were predominantly what we would call females. So these are early learning communities. But why I bring up the reket is the reket didn't just teach symbolic life, and they didn't just teach, they researched. They were trying to figure out things. They were trying to figure out medicine, figure out math, figure out the stars, all of that stuff. And so, in other words, scole, leisure time. And now I went into a language that's pre-Greek. These leisure communities began to create not just learning communities, but also research learning communities. And what a lot of people don't understand is what research is not simply the lone individual going around trying to figure things out. Research is just continued learning. And so this could be communal learning. It could be if certain people cannot help you, you learn by yourself. You and I are basically just people who fell in love with learning and continue to learn either with others, and if there's no one else around, we use whatever resources we have to continue learning. So many societies, often later on priestly or religious, what we would call religious, again, that's an imposition on the past, but these multitude of learning communities, I prefer to think of what we call the university as advanced learning communities. That's what I consider them. And advanced learning communities where people produce research, okay? Now, there are different versions from the academy to the lyceum among the Greeks. You could find, if the ancient priestly groups all along the Indus Valley. You could find it all along Asia. It's all along the African continent. There are many kinds of vast learning communities that were developed very early. These are among the reasons that they helped humanity thrive. And many of them were in proximities of urban areas. Urbanization was very early in our species. I mean, moderately, given the way we think of time today, right? And these large urban areas posed a lot of challenges for living, particularly living together. So these were in effect what we would call universities. The thing about it, of course, is if you're going to research and you're going to have leisure time, you're going to be critical and creative. And that's always going to lead to tension with the conservatives, with people who think the fundamental issue, the only issue, is to keep the fight going against exigency, right? So for them, it's all about the military, all about trying to find food, it's just all about protection, safety, safety, safety. But of course, there's going to be the other group who that group says, yeah, but I want to use the leisure time to think, to be creative, to dance, to figure things out, to try different things, to experiment. And there's always been that tension between those who want to say, we got it right, keep it as it is, and those who say, who says this is the end of the story? Let's be creative, let's keep trying. This has happened back and forth. And whenever there are periods of either famine or social disruption, the conservatives begin to assert themselves and say, and they're trying to find causes for it, and they point to the people of creativity and change and so forth, and slap them around and say, why are you people creating upheaval? We now need to have sacrifices, kill, train, get rid of the stranger, all of that stuff. And this goes back and forth. So this is connected to the observation you made about the periods in which universities, or what we call universities, become reactionary, right? They get pulled back in. Now, just to make the story shorter, because I know you have more questions, the one that's dominated the way we think of the university today really goes back to Bologna, right? Italy. That was during the period in which there's begun the early sparks of what we know as Euro-modern colonialism. Euro-modern colonialism, as it began to expand, was not that much interested in research. What it was interested more is managing of empires. It began to need to have a sufficiently educated group to manage to manage the cargo you're bringing in, to develop techniques to find a way to get the ships to work. This was happening also in the Islamic world, even though a lot of it was happening over land, because they had their versions of universities as well. And you needed people to say how many slaves you have, how many goods, etc. So another thing began to grow. It became not only the military groups and the kings and all of those, it also began to be connected to the growing mercantile class, the people who want to manage things, and eventually capitalism. So what we began to find then is an ongoing tension between the people who are looking for the leisure time, the humanity element of what research and education offer, right? That element, the growth. They saw the purpose as trying to have human beings realize our potential. But then the other group, the conservatives, they're not interested in that. They're interested in management, control, safety, et cetera, et cetera. This tension goes back and forth. You've seen it in different periods. The big shift in terms of this issue happened, frankly, in Germany, because in a lot of the others, it was very clearly stated. You need an educated class to manage empires and to manage, growing areas, to have a managerial class. But the Germans began to think a lot in terms of a research concept. And the research university emerged among the Germans. But then, as imperial shifts emerge, and it just yada, 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 skip over the stories. You have the British and the French version. As American imperialism ascended, the Americans wanted to have the managerial groups, but they saw all of this cool stuff happening out of research. So they created a marriage of the German research university with the French and British managerial universities, and you have the American university. And it's no accident that the hegemonic model of this zeitgeist of this moment has the American university on top. It doesn't mean it'll be permanent, but because right now we're in a period of fascism. We're in a period of people who are absolutely destroying the planet, trying to ignore the realities not only of science, but the very project of the humanitarian humanities aspect of research. And as they're trying to tear down the American university, there's a serious question of what is going to come out of those ashes. But this is, I know I talked for a long time, but this is just to give a little context to what's going on here. And just to give one brief point, in between, there's always been a revolutionary, radical, humanitarian, and ecological element at work. So you brought up pedagogy. Paulo Freire, as an example in critical pedagogy, was basically arguing that the reactionary model took the position that only the elite deserve a humanitarian education. They're the only ones cognitively capable of such growth. Whereas people like Antonio Gramsci, all the way through to Frantz Fanon and Paulo Freire, took the position that that is absolutely false, that ultimately education and freedom are linked, and that all human beings, ultimately through the use of their critical senses, can realize their potential. But what we need to do is to liberate the system of education from duplicating the infrastructural inequalities and inequities of the societies in which they're located.
I mean, this is a very, I deeply appreciate Prof for being elaborative. It's not at all that you were going long. I think it is very important for us to get this a kind of kaleidoscopic viewpoint of the whole idea of the university. And while I was listening to you about the different ideas about how the whole phenomenon of university got established and eventually what we see in the contemporary times, I was also thinking about one of your very interesting perspective that you have written in multiple places, but one specific article that comes in my mind is the pedagogical imperative of pedagogical imperatives. And since we are talking about liberatory pedagogy and we began on such a fascinating elaborative note, now I would like to listen to some of your perspectives about um pedagogical imperatives. And again, once again, considering our contemporary circumstances and across the world in different scenarios, we are talking about, like, for instance, right now in India, I believe, although you have been in it for a very short span of time, but then you keep coming and going. So I believe you're probably aware of the fact that especially with a lot of private institutions, also government higher education institutions are also adopting the process of liberal education. So the liberal arts education is severely high right now in India. But then, when it comes to the practical questions and very fundamental questions, what is liberal arts? How much liberal is liberal arts? How much people are aware of the histories and the foundations of liberal arts? What are their global perspectives? Often we don't find an answer because it just exists, what you currently refer to as the capitalistic university. It just exists as the managerial discipline because, I mean, it is somewhere, if I have to put it out bluntly, it is one of the current cash cows. Okay, so you have a liberal arts department, you have a very high registration fees. It sounds like quite fancy to say that I have got a BA in liberal arts, I have got an MA in liberal arts, rather than saying that I have got an MA in history or English or sociology. So, it is sort of hailed as a part of the interdisciplinary transition, of the country. But then there we see there are, I mean, not only just the question of lack of clarity, but also there is also this entrenched intention of having generating capitalistic gains out of it rather than focusing on the production of knowledge. And in this regard, your idea of pedagogical imperatives that vary amongst a lot of perspectives that very strictly talk about the question of not fetishizing a particular discipline as the godly discipline, and which is still very much in vogue in across institutions across the world, is, I think, a very, very strong, practical, and of course, very much practicable step to sort of think the idea of university in the practical terms in a more diverse, in a more inclusive, and also in a more human ways. Because I know you have talked a lot about the question of humanity, about your experiences in teaching in schools where people never expected to have a retention rate of 10%. After you went in, it just went up to 85%. These are all so much connected and tied to the question of the pedagogical imperatives. So in this chaotic scenario, which also you talked about a lot, where do you see the role of pedagogical imperatives?
Okay. Well, the first thing I'd like to say is there's something, first of all, the pedagogical imperative is something that Jane Anna Gordon and I developed. And it's rather interesting that we were both, before we became professors, secondary school teachers. Okay. So we were in a context in which we our experience of teaching and learning were with adolescents. Okay. In my case, also, I worked in what's used to be called special education. So I had to work with the what were considered the most difficult students to teach. Okay. So I've had to work with students from everything from severe disorders to delinquency, all kinds of very, very difficult things. Okay. Now, so I just bring that up because there's something I saw when I was working in that context. Because we have a limited time, I'm just going to get straight to the point. What I observed was that when people are treated like people, they grow. And when they're not, they wither. It's just very straightforward. A lot of there are all kinds of techniques I was expected to use as an educator, but none of them would have worked if those students did not walk into a classroom in which they were embraced as with dignity, okay, as valuable, okay? And dignity, of course, is about worth. It's really, as Anna Julia Cooper said in A Voice from the South, what are you worth? Well, every human being wants to be worthy, whether we call that worthiness respect or love, okay? Some people may look for fame, but at the heart of it is the idea of love and respect. Now, the pedagogical imperative is connected to the very notion of education. Education means to draw out, to make grow, to lead, to enable people to grow. So you could already see the connection, right? If you're acknowledging your value makes you grow, then denying it will make you wither. So there's a link between that and education. Now, for the philosophers in the room, they know that Kant had this thing called the categorical imperative, but Kant was obsessed with laws and all of that stuff. He made a distinction between a categorical imperative and a hypothetical, imperative. Basically, the latter is in order to do something, you need to get something else, whereas the categorical imperative was absolute. Now, it struck us that there were things missing in those kind of that's very alien, very formal. What the young people we worked with were looking for was not simply for somebody to say you're a human being, because they already knew that. They were looking to be treated in a certain way, which required communicating with them as human beings. Now, that required something else. It required something that was missing in the Kantian model. And what Jane and I noticed is that what was missing is humility. Humility, if you go back to that story I told from scole to leisure time, as leisure time to devoting to human things, what humility is realizing you're not a god. What a lot of those young people I worked with, those adolescents, were struggling with is a world in which many adults lie to them. The lie that adults tell children is that we're gods. And of course, as gods, what defense does one have against a god? The problem, of course, and this is what Paulo Freire noticed, is that the problem, if you treat yourself as a god, is you don't have room for growth. And you rip away from those you're teaching agency because they don't get to participate in their learning. They don't own their learning. The idea is they're simply to receive information, knowledge, and Freire called it the banking model. Now, unfortunately, this is returning with a vengeance, and it's returning through large language models, artificial intelligence, the tech world. Even things like Grammarly lie. They're pretending they're not AI, LLM, but they are. The problem with large language models, the problem with the banking model, is they only work for information. They don't work for education. Because you see, no one educates you. You actually educate yourself. Someone works with you on your education. This means then that the professor, the teacher, whoever is in charge, by saying what I am is a co-student. I'm learning and I love learning. So in learning together, when a student sees a teacher as an advanced student, what the student sees is not shame about being a student. What a student sees is potential in being a student. It means what the student brings to the learning experience is something that the teacher may not have, which is, of course, the student's experience. The teacher, as a student, has his, or their student experience. So, what happens in this moment is that they not only teach one another, but it also makes the student more comfortable from learning what the advanced student has to offer. In that process, then, this humility of the teacher, right? And all humility which is linked to the word human, is linked to, interestingly enough, the word humus, which means dirt. It means to be from the ground. So it means being grounded. There are these postmodern types who are anti-human and so forth, but they completely miss what humanity is about because they only think of the human being as arrogant. They don't realize that's when a human being is trying to be a god. To embrace your humanity is to let go of arrogance and to understand that you are on the ground, on the earth. So the idea that you're there together, every teacher, I always begin my courses with this kind of conversation with my students. Every teacher knows this. You could teach the same subject 10 years in a row. Every semester or every year, it is different. It is different not only for metaphysical reasons of time, it is also different because a human being is not a thing. A human being is a set of relationships. And every year, those new students are new relationships. So you learn something with them that is different. Additionally, because when you reread a text, you're now in a different orientation to it. So it too is different. This process then of continuous, ritualized, repeated learning is a repetition that's never the same. In that process, then, the student takes on the task of co learning. And what one learns then is that the pedagogical imperative is to share the love of learning. The goal isn't about a conglomeration of information. That happens along the way, but that is not what education is. The falling in love with learning to the point where, if properly struck with that wonderful fever, the student will continue to learn after the encounter. True learning is when you begin to experiment, think about it yourself, talk about it with your friends. One of my favorite, what I love, absolutely love, is when my students tell me that they were talking about the subject with their parents. Because at that moment, the learning continued beyond the classroom. And then their parents get involved. And I'm not kidding. There are times in my classes, there's this elderly person or an older person in the classroom because they came from the conversations they're having with their child, or in this case, if it's a university student, their offspring, who's now a young adult, and their parents come to learn. And you could imagine what it is to the student to know that their parent fell in love with learning, and they could see that although their parents are authorities, they're older, their love of learning is a shared authoritativeness with their continued growth. So what we are people who continue to grow through learning, and what we want to share is that love. That is what Paulo Freire was talking about. That was what Fanon was talking about. That was what Antonio Gramsci was talking about. And when he talks about education, that's also what Sri Aurobindo talks about. I see it also in Kaiji Nishitani in Japan, but there are many others. I see this in some of the ancient texts that I've read. I've seen it for instance, the debates from Kununúp, right? In The Eloquent Peasant, a text from 4,000 years ago. And I also see it in Kongzui, or Confucius's writing, the way he talks about the very process of developing, moving into Ren, which is our humanity.
Thank you
Oh,
so much, Prof. I
sorry,
mean, yeah,
sorry, just one very brief
sure,
thing.
sure.
You hinted at a concept I talk about in my book, Disciplinary Decadence, which is the concept of a teleological suspension of disciplinarity. Very briefly, what Sharon was bringing up is that the pedagogical imperative is to give a critique of disciplinary decadence as well. Disciplinary decadence treats disciplines and the methods as closed. And if that collapses disciplines just into information. The problem with that is we develop disciplines, which are human created phenomena, through our relationship with reality in the world and one another. So, what we try to do, if disciplines are most alive when they're learning, but we don't learn by ourselves. So disciplines can learn from other disciplines. And when they together, they're still not learning, they create new disciplines through the process of transcending them for the sake of reality. And I have a fancy term for that, the teleological suspension of disciplinarity. Teleological because purposeful, suspension because we realize our disciplines are not ontological or whole or complete, and reality because reality is always bigger than us. Reality is always changing and dynamic. So that's just a little hint of it. So in the pedagogical imperative is also a teleological suspension of disciplinarity.
Um, Thank you so much for this very fascinating perspectives, Professor Gordon. In fact, uh, when you were elaborating in continuity with your responses, when you were elaborating on the question of the pedagogical imperatives and what it teaches about being human in the process of learning and co-learning and co-sharing, and also associated with the question of teleological suspension of disbelief. Um, I was also thinking about the different aspects that you have engaged with in terms of the question of asymmetry, and which I believe, of course, based on your philosophical perspectives that you have shared, um, and I know you often use, and at least the different live lectures and the conversations that I've attended thus far, you often begin with references, very strong references to music, and also just to let all of us know who are not aware of the fact that Professor Gordon is a fantastic chef, a fantastic musician, and he's like fantastic in the sense he's like a very serious musician who plays drums, who have been actually, I mean, of course, it's a never-ending conversation. We know that we don't have much of time, but just to let all people know that, um, I mean, he doesn't use the word accidental for sure, but also he's very conscious about the fact that he never ever aspired to be in the academic and the research space because he was a full-fledged musician when he started going to the university for studies. And that is what a lot of references he draw in terms of the question of asymmetry, which is an essential part of philosophical understanding, which is also a very essential part of our understanding the values of being human, the values of being valuing each other's differences and the diversities. And most importantly, every aspect of our existence have some kind of rhythms. It doesn't have to be fit within certain preconditioned parameters, but just can be perceived as we go ahead, as Prof also mentioned the question of continuity. But before I get into the space, I mean, of course, because I don't want to manipulate the whole space. We had the major chunk of the conversation. I would like to request, you know, people just feel free to share your thoughts, perspectives. Necessarily, it doesn't have to be a question. It can be just an experience sharing or anything that you wish to. If you want to, if you are very comfortable, feel free to unmute yourself and share your thoughts. In case you're shy, no problem. Just put your thought in the chat box, and I'm sure Prof. Gordon will be very happy to respond to that. And maybe, Prof, I mean, while people are thinking, I know there is so much to think around. Will you like to share some brief ideas about your engagement with the aspect of asymmetry in your pedagogical approaches, in your pedagogical understanding?
Well, sure. I mean, well, it's a very tricky thing, mainly because the the many of the institutions, particularly those we talked about, premised upon hegemonic forms of power, are asymmetrical. Okay, the but at the same time, the human condition is already structured in a symmetrical way, and that is because we are linked to this thing that's called reality. Now, what I mean by that is that reality is what not only flows through us, but if we had no way of sensing or experiencing reality, we would not be able to live or get through a day. This is something every human being must have, not only human being, every life form, okay? It must be able to negotiate or integrate or experience or sense reality, okay? Now, what's tricky is that because we're embodied, we are able to do something very extraordinary. The first part is, of course, we're able to articulate the word here. In other words, reality is everywhere, including here. But we're able to have knowledge by articulating something is there, which means elsewhere. But here's the extraordinary part. That part is not particularly unusual, but the extraordinary part is when we say something is there, we can develop an empathetic or sympathetic relationship to there as a here. In other words, we realize that our here is also a there. That enables the social world and intersubjectivity. It enables us to have evidence, but it enables us to realize that the kind of hegemonic asymmetry is ultimately a lie. Because the asymmetrical, hegemonic asymmetry is to tell us that some of us are permanently, absolutely, exclusively a there and never a here, which would in effect mean none of us, except for those who impose that upon us, have a point of view. You see? Now, there are other things that are at work from when we're able to see others' point of view. And what is extraordinary is that it's not only about another human being's point of view. What's extraordinary about this ability is we can have look and think about the value and the perspective and the suffering of a tree, of another animal, and even something that for all purposes don't seem alive, like a stone. This is something extraordinary. And this is something overlooked when many people think about science, because it is our ability to think of even a stone or the smallest atom or even a photon as a perspective that enables us to have science. The very idea, even when we, and not just science, the arts. When I play drums or play piano, I'm not simply tapping a thing. Okay. I am becoming one with that and speaking the way I'm speaking right now. This is how music is able to occur. If someone simply, you hear it when someone simply bangs on a piano. That is treating it as a thing. Or if someone just picks up a sitar or a tabla or and just, thingify it, there's no music. So what we do with music and what we do with science and what we do with not only the arts, but the whole constellation of epistemic practices is to do what a wonderful philosopher, her name is Tina Rourke, she wrote a book called Dynamic Realism. What she says is we make it become alive. You see, real education and learning must be alive. This is when a student is bored, it's because it's not alive. Making it living is what we're doing in our research. And that making it alive is because, and this may sound, spooky to people, but reality is alive. If reality were not alive, nothing would be happening. Nothing would be changing. Nothing would be transformed. So we start with a fundamental asymmetry, which is thingification, right? As if I'm only what's real and everything else is there. But that is a lie. Learning is to break it down and to create the intersubjectivity of co-living.
Fantastic, Prof. I still don't see questions, and I know that the things that we have really talked about, they do require a lot of deep thinking. But
I see
yeah. Oh,
Mahmoud.
also,
Mahmoud has a question.
Mahmoud is a question. Fantastic. Please go ahead,
Yeah,
Mahmoud.
Mahmoud.
Thank you so much. It's fantastic and wonderful to hear Professor Gordon. I'm sorry, when you start speaking, I replied, but it seems that I was muted. So congratulations, Jian, on your book award, and also congratulations for Professor Gordon on his 30th anniversary of the book, which I really like and admire. I'm fascinated by the connection that is made. Professor Gordon has been making between the human as a relationship, education, and also the idea of learning and in the sense of changing the self, which something that is almost absent from the whole university places. Universities are not a place for cultivating a new relationship with the world. For example, how Professor Gordon is speaking about relation with even what is perceived as inanimate, like stone or the piano or the any non-human being. And I see this, like maybe Professor Godwin will speak more about it, the idea of it is the presupposition of the primacy of reason and rationality uh, within the predominant westernized educational institution that disallow this idea of thinking about the university as a place of learning together collectively with other people to form new relations with others, whether human or non-human, and 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 if we take this seriously, also we think differently about the relation with these new model of information producing, like ChatGPT or like AI or all these, because these are not like tools to learn to change the self. It's like always predicated on the idea that the more you know information and you produce things like that are based on memory, for example, like the capacity to memorize so much or so on, it it makes you better in the race to be more knowledgeable, quote unquote. So these presuppositions like does not do not like uh, accommodate what Professor Gordon trying to advocate, to think about it as a space of learning, of changing the self in a way um, that produce a new or different relations uh, to reality, to the world, whether to different uh, like non-human beings and so on. So I would like, Professor Gordon, if he can speak a little more on the idea of not only the university or the any kind of educational space as a space of cultivating new self, new ways of thinking about the world. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Mahmoud. And it's always good to see you. The short version is that education changes us, but information is a very different project. And this is what you're bringing up, Mahmoud, is the tension between instrumental rationality and reason. A lot of people miss this distinction. Instrumental rationality is about control. It's simply about trying to get one within an order of laws. Okay. Um, for the rest who are observing the conversation, I often illustrate this in some of my public lectures this way. If a couple gets, I often ask the audience if any of them would like to be married to a maximally consistent person. Instrumental rationality aims at maximal consistency. It means you must never contradict yourself. You must never have a contradiction because its goal is laws. And when I often ask the audience, there are usually two people who would raise their hands, but most people would shudder the thought. And I usually answer because they know what that would be. It would be called hell. And the reason is, at a certain point in a conflict, what one would say to one's partner is, you are so maximally consistent that you're unreasonable. One of the paradoxes of reason is linked to reality, which means it is not constrained. It's not that it's against rationality. It's just that reason is to evaluate it. And once you are to evaluate something, you already begin to transcend it, because reason requires knowing not only when to obey or follow a rule, but reason is also knowing when to disobey, when actually to reject that rule, right? Because reason is linked to other dimensions of life, like ethics, affect, love, care. It's unacceptable from the point of purely instrumental rationality to say, why didn't you turn that person in? And your answer is, because I love them. That makes no sense from the point of view of instrumental rationality. Or these silly examples, two children are drowning. Which do you save? They're equidistant from opposite sides of a river, and one is your child. From a Kantian instrument, purely rational point of view, they're absolutely equal. But as we know, you have to save your child from the point of view of love, etc. So there are all kinds of dimensions of life that we learn about, and this is the tricky thing, right? Because the other thing that some people don't understand that's very important, that's linked ironically to reason, and a lot of people miss this, is mythos. Because mythos, which just means from the mouth, myth is linked to narration. Meaning can never emerge without myth, without repetition. Right? To be externally observing something as a pure signifier, that's not meaning, that's just signs. Meaning is to be affected. So all of those elements, when you are affected, you're moved. And if you're moved, you grow, you change. So yes, what is happening right now, what you're bringing up, Mahmoud, is and Cheyenne brought it up too, is the imposition of commodification on education. When you commodify education, you erase education and you replace it with information. Okay, this is when you just have rote, narrow set of skills, etc. Sometimes when I teach, I ask my students, are you here for education or certification? And certification is a commodity. And I said, well, I know you need to get a job, so certification is very helpful. But there are people who are certified but idiots. What the ideal world would be to be certified and educated. That is our goal. Now, there's a lot of empirical evidence that what we offer as academics which is not the same as intellectuals. It would be great if many academics were also intellectuals. But the academic intellectual distinction is similar to the reason rationality distinction. An academic is a professional who's mastered a set of skills. But a teacher, an intellectual, is a person who has a greater grounding and understanding of what to do with those skills, you see? And those are linked more to the larger mission of what a university is about. Unfortunately, right now, most universities are being dominated by managerial elites. And managerial elites are increasingly, at first, distant from education. They're no longer in the classrooms. They're no longer researching, you see? But even worse, they're not looking at education to develop the telos of academic management. And what do I mean by that? Well, education has a different conception of time. But academic management is increasingly drawing inspiration for time from corporate management. But corporate time is very different. Quarterly yields are very different from whether a young person grows or whether a young person's imagination contributes to society in an unexpected way. The truth of the matter is, education is an ongoing project, and academic management is supposed to make fertile the conditions for those relationships. However, academic management is increasingly being dehumanized. Increasingly, there are people who are coming in who are consultants. And consultants are often people who don't know what the hell they're talking about. They tend to be connected to firms who are extracting from universities fees that are designed not actually to create fertile ground for education, but actually to create a mythical, in the negative sense of myth, fictional conception of efficiency. And that is often defined as what you should get rid of. The thing about it is that education requires something extraordinarily creative. It's always about adding. When Cheyenne asked me about those adolescents I worked with, for instance, one of the things that a consultant, extractive managerial model, if they had walked into my classroom, they would have been absolutely outraged and would have wanted me to get rid of almost everything that worked. And here's one of the things they would immediately want me to do. Because a lot of my students were traumatized and they had a sense of low self-esteem, I spent the first 2 weeks having a conversation with them about learning. But what I did at first was I had all the classrooms absolutely empty. We had no furniture, nothing, absolutely nothing. There were just rooms painted white. Now, at a certain point, once what the students began to say, why is the room empty? And I said, well, because we don't yet know what we should put into it that would help you learn better. So the students and I actually started talking about what would help them learn better. And we collectively went shopping. We went to Goodwill places and we found a way to raise money and bought the kinds of chairs and tables that they would learn better with. There was one student who was an artist, and he thought the white walls would be better if instead of just painting them colors, he created murals. He painted murals on the wall. So and it pissed off the custodial workers because they said it didn't follow the union rules and we were violating the law. And then there were other people pissed off that this is not standard, blah, blah, blah furniture. But these students owned it, you see. When they walked into that room, they had a home, a space. And then the curriculum. we I didn't tell them what we had to learn. They began to talk about, they themselves began to talk about what they need to learn. And it turned out that they began to learn at a higher level of math, a higher level of history, science, because they were loving what they were learning. They weren't asking what was age appropriate learning, you see? So the principal at the school got pissed off because he was saying, why are they doing college level learning? They're in high school. You see? And I was saying, if they could learn at a college level, then let them do it. And it turns out that a lot of them, when we started math, a lot of them, all of them said they were terrible at math. It turned out they were not only excellent at math, but one of them was so good at it that she went through the entire math textbook in 2 weeks and went on to computational theory and began to assist the math professor. This was within 1 month. I ended up writing a letter for her to get a scholarship to university. So the whole point of this story is that it doesn't have to be only at the secondary level, is what I'm saying. It could be at the undergraduate level, the doctoral level, at all the levels, that we should enable people to reach for the skies of their potential. But they do so if they are in love with what they're doing. And of course, there'll be some things they don't like doing, but as long as they know they can learn, they can approach those other things in a different way. I hope that was helpful to connect because we have a big task at hand. There are two levels of assault on universities today. One of them is capitalism. Capitalism is not interested in education. Capitalism wants students to just be using ChatGPT, Grammarly, and whatever else, and sitting isolatedly, staring at something to, you know, claim their learning. And the other one is fascism. Reason fascism doesn't want people to become educated is because when people get educated, they dissent. They don't sit and passively agree with everything. And the other thing that happens when people begin educated, they become aware of what a higher standard of living is. Not higher in the bourgeois sense. Bourgeois standard of living is about whether you have a fancy car or an expensive home. No, a higher standard of living is knowing what it is to appreciate a good food, even when it's the poor people's food. There's excellent, right, cheap food. Higher standard of living is when you know what it is to wear what is comfortable for you, what enables you to be able to set your home in such a way that you could have good conversations, what it is to be able to uh, cultivate sufficient leisure time to be able to travel, what it is to live healthier. Those are higher standards of living. And higher standards of living is understanding that you can create a society in which people don't have to be working in a laborious way perpetually, that people can actually have the kind of expansion of leisure time to spend with their families and their friends. And those are the kinds of things that that education properly would offer. But what the tech bros want right now, as an example, is a world of service, profit, and what they call efficiency without people. And if you think about that, right, what the implications of that would be ex- absolutely, absolutely misanthropic, profound, and would devastate life on our planet. So thank you for the question.
Fascinating. I think we just have to kind of come to the sort of course, not a final closure because we will continue the conversation again, and I'm sure we will have Prof Gordon very soon in one of the future Addas to continue with this conversation. But I mean, I wish to thank Prof. Gordon for always having such fascinating perspectives, bringing in philosophies with the elements of praxis, which always gives us this, showcases this pathway of not just thinking in terms of theories and methods, but also simultaneously, what does it mean to practice? What could be the challenges and possibilities? And thank you all for being, part of the process. Sharing your thoughts, listening. I'm sure, we will always have a lot of thoughts and questions to think about. And as I already shared, that this will be in the record. If you wish to go back and listen to multiple number of times, feel free to do so.